Jesus is easily the most significant figure in human history. While he never wrote a book and he only spent about 3 years doing public ministry, sort of in the public eye, he started a movement. And today, roughly 30% of the population of the planet would identify as one of his followers. Jesus is much more than a brilliant intellectual, but he's certainly not less. Dallas Willard once said, "There is in our culture an uneasy relation between Jesus and intelligence." But this is not how it should be. People were captivated by Jesus at every turn. I was really struck when I was writing my book, Logic and the Way of Jesus, how many times the Gospels say that people were astonished by Jesus. And of course, this had to do with Jesus doing miracles, but more often than not, it was that people were astonished by Jesus's teaching. He had the ability and the skillfulness to articulate truths, often with great simplicity, but in a way that really sort of draws us in and convicts our hearts. And I think points to a level of genius that's just unmatched in human history. And I think Peter J. Williams would agree with that. I had the great privilege to sit down with Peter Williams and discuss his new book, The Surprising Genius of Jesus. Peter Williams is the principal and CEO of Tyndale House, which is a Cambridge-based research institute. He received his MA, his MPhil, and his PhD from the University of Cambridge. Much of this work focused on ancient languages related to the Bible. And as we'll see, I'll ask him how many languages he can work in, and he doesn't even know the number. He has numerous scholarly publications. He is a member of the Oversight Committee for the ESV translation of the Bible. And he's the author of the popular Can We Trust the Gospels, which I've actually used in some of my classes here at DBU. But his latest publication is a really terrific little book called The Surprising Genius of Jesus, What the Gospels Reveal About the Greatest Teacher. He looks at Jesus' unbelievable ability to tell a story and has a kind of special focus on the parable of the prodigal son, or as he calls it, the parable of the two sons, which is by far my favorite story that Jesus tells. He shows how striking this story is for its simplicity while being, so very profound. And he shows how Jesus weaves in and alludes to just a surprising number of Old Testament narratives throughout, such that the story, holds up on its own. Anybody could read it. The uneducated could read it. You don't have to know the Old Testament to see how profound the story is. But you can also, in a way, spend the rest of your life exploring its depth. Peter Williams was here on campus at Dallas Baptist University and was kind enough to sit down with me. Hang on till the end. I've got a great scholarship offer from DBU to tell you about.
Well, Peter Williams, thanks so much for sitting down with me for a few minutes. I've been a big fan for a while. I've been aware of your work, and what I love about your work is that by every metric, you're a scholar. You're a very successful scholar. Is it 3 degrees from the little upstart?
That young
university,
Cambridge University,
right? It just started in the medieval period, but should make it. But very prestigious degrees and terrific work. Now, I heard a rumor that I wanted to check with you, and it was about how many languages you speak. So do you have a number of the languages that you speak or
speak is the wrong word.
Work
I mean,
in?
I read them, and the nice thing about dead languages or languages on the page is the words just wait for you. They've got all day, you've got all day. When you're in a speaking situation, then people can actually say 10 words to you in a second in their language, or they just come out very fast, and it's almost impossible to process. So I focus on reading languages rather than speaking them. But
do you have a number though?
I don't. I mean,
you don't?
Again, I like to read the Bible in different languages. It slows you down in your reading. So I find it's a good way just to read with care. to notice slight different nuances in what's coming out.
Yeah.
And so over the years, some people memorize scripture. I don't have a lot of scripture memorized, but I have read the Bible in an awful number of different languages, and just that helps you see things. And that's where my focus has been.
Sure. Awesome. And so then, so you've got the scholarly side of it, but you're also able to write books and speak to popular audiences, and certainly what I aspire to do as well. And so I've been a fan for a while. So the book is called The Surprising Genius of Jesus, What the Gospels Reveal About the Greatest Teacher. So what's surprising here? So, it could have been titled The Genius of Jesus, but it's The Surprising Genius of Jesus.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I mean, my original title proposed to the publisher was The Genius of Jesus, and they wanted the word surprising in. And I think part of that is we often accept that Jesus is very knowledgeable because he's God.
Yeah.
What I think is new here is trying to argue that we actually have tangible evidence in the form of the things that are in the gospel said by him, which show us intellectual cleverness of a measurable kind.
Yes.
And I think that's a new element.
Sure.
Because I think people have often would accept that on the basis of, say, Mozart's symphonies, that Mozart's a genius, or on the basis of Leonardo da Vinci's paintings, that he's a genius, or his inventions. And they don't actually look at what Jesus has said in terms of a work of art.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to do, particularly with this major story, his longest story, the 3-minute story of the two sons that you get in Luke 15. And what you can pack into 3 minutes, I mean, it's just incredible.
Yeah. And it is incredible. And the book is really just filled with those insights. Give us a few highlights, or sort of a highlight reel of those sort of subtle insights.
Yeah, so part of the thesis is that, as Luke sets it up, he's got tax collectors and sinners he's talking to. You don't expect them to know the Bible. And scribes and Pharisees who do know the Bible, and particularly scribes copy the Bible out. So in a sense, he's got two audiences. Now, anyone who can teach two audiences simultaneously is already
especially
really
those
clever.
Two audiences.
But he's able to tell a story where it works if you don't know any of the Bible at all. It's just a simple story about a runaway son, a resentful older brother. But also, if you do know the Bible, it works at a very deep level.
Yeah.
So when he says a man had two sons, you find that if you think about the Old Testament, there are various people who had two sons. The most famous person to have two and only two sons is Isaac. He has Esau and Jacob tricks Esau out of his inheritance. That's why Esau is angry, like the older brother's angry in this story. And Jacob has to go off into a far country. He feeds animals. And when he comes back, what's so striking is you get the only time in the entire Bible where it says someone runs, embraces, and kisses.
Yeah.
And that is Esau, the older brother, welcoming his little brother who tricked him out of the inheritance back from a foreign land. Now, you think about this, that the older brother in Jesus' story is resentful that the younger brother's coming back, and he might be scrounging a little bit off the inheritance that the older brother got. And what you see is, based on this Old Testament reading, that it's the older brother who should have been running, embracing, and kissing.
Right.
The younger brother, after all, he got his inheritance early because his little brother asked dad.
Yeah.
And so that's one element of it. But also, a man had two sons. It could remind you of Adam and Cain and Abel. And then you've got the sort of Bible's first family conflict is the envy of an older brother at the acceptance of a younger brother. Then you have this conversation between God and the older brother, like the conversation between the father and the older brother in this story. Or a man had two sons could remind you of Abraham, who has Ishmael and Isaac. Yes, there are more sons later. And the interesting thing there is that Abraham is the archetypal father, but he's also the first person in the Bible to run. If you're a scribe, you notice that. The very first word from his mouth when he runs in Genesis 18 to Sarah is quick. That's the first time anyone ever says quick in the Bible, is Abraham. Again, if you're a scribe, you notice the first time you come across something, and then he goes and gets a fatted calf. Oh, that's the Bible's first calf.
Yeah.
So all of those are like firsts in the Bible, and Abraham's an old guy at the time, so that's another feature which matches with Jesus' story. So it's like Jesus is bringing together all of these Old Testament stories, particularly from Genesis, into this short 3-minute story. And that's remarkable. It's even got the story of Joseph in, because it's got suddenly bringing out a ring and a robe. that happens in Genesis 41-42 to Joseph, the only other son that the father thought was dead and then is alive again. So there are lots of links there. And so overall, it's just genius.
Yeah. Yeah. And is part of it, so one thing I didn't notice till reading the book was that they divided the inheritance between them. You always think of it as going to the prodigal and the father hanging on to the other half, I guess, or however it would go. But that was a bit surprising to me there, because then it sets up, kind of this tension almost in the story, it seems, in some ways.
Yeah. And the older brother has done really well. I mean, obviously it doesn't tell you what country the story takes place in. It's a story, but you can imagine if it's under Old Testament law that the older brother gets double what the younger brother does. He certainly does very well.
Right. What would be shocking in this story? I think there's some parts that are sort of obviously shocking. The prodigal son asking for his inheritance early. Are there other parts to it that you think would be shocking to that audience?
Lots of parts, really. So the father giving away everything, that's shocking. I think, yes, it's very cheeky of the younger brother to ask for his inheritance. But then after all, the younger son has shamed the father publicly, and he's coming back now without his shoes, without anything. And therefore, the father to run in a society where older people don't generally run, it's undignified. And then to accept him, throw a robe round him, basically fully accept him, and give him a ring, which is like quite close to a credit card. That's just outrageous. And so the sheer emotion, the acceptance, that's all very surprising. You would have thought the father ought to be angry. So I think it is really a stunning story. And then when you think about how it's aimed with the final 38% about the older brother, where it really is reminding you about the situation of the scribes and Pharisees who have had their inheritance but are resentful of the idea that these wasters should be allowed back. I mean, you think about it. If you're a Pharisee and you like money but you also donate to the temple, they do. But that tax collector over there that Jesus is hanging out with, that he, squeezed money out of you to help Rome Incorporated last week. So the idea that he can go from that to sort of somehow access to God, that is deeply offensive, because you've invested so much of your working life in building up the temple and not the Roman Empire. And then that guy's actually undermining your work. And so that's the challenge, where people who work hard on the things associated with their faith can easily resent what might seem like cheap grace, quick acceptance. The father's generosity is pretty outrageous. And even the thought, well, if the older brother owns the farm, like, how can it be that the father is this generous about, that's the time to kill the fatted calf? Let's give the robe, the best robe. I mean, whose is the best robe? Is it dad's or is it big brother's? Doesn't say. It leaves these quite uncomfortable things in your mind. Or why isn't it that everyone knows there's a party on except for the older brother? So I think it's a very uncomfortable story when you think about it.
And do you think that's part of, so I've always thought of Jesus saying, let those with ears to hear listen, that kind of thing, almost like, let me draw you into the story. Let me shock you a little bit so that you can hear this.
So the interesting thing, this is Luke 15. What you've just quoted, like the one who has ears to hear, listen, that's the very last phrase in Luke 14. So it's just before it sets you up. Then you've got what's happening is the tax collectors and sinners are coming near to hear Jesus. And of course, hear is this really important word at the time, because the righteous, devout Jews are reciting Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 every day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then it says the scribes and Pharisees are grumbling, which reminds you of how Israel in the desert is grumbling. So it's like the bad guys, tax collectors and sinners, are doing the right thing. The good guys, the Pharisees and the scribes, are doing the wrong thing. And so again, that's just
drawing them
just powerful.
in. Yeah, absolutely. The famine. So it's not just that he squanders all the wealth, but he becomes unemployable because of the famine.
So we tend to think of this as the prodigal story, the prodigal son, but it's partly the story of the prodigal plus unlucky son, because Jesus could have had him go to a far country and then not be a famine.
Yeah.
But the fact is that there is a famine allows you to think when he gets to feed pigs, it's not just because there's a famine. It's also not because of his bad decisions. It's also because there's a famine. So you never just get the result of his bad decisions, which is interesting. It sort of slightly lets him off the hook. Contrast with how the older brother sees it, that he's just there because he's wasted his livelihood with prostitutes or his father's livelihood with prostitutes. It's a different analysis. And yes, he doesn't get any food. That's the interesting thing. Some people who read it superficially might think he's getting some pig food. No, he's not. He longs to be filled with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gives him anything. So the point is he's not getting anything. And that's part of just the desperation of the situation.
Yeah, sort of sets up the brokenness that drives him back home. And then the father, I just love this picture of the father waiting and watching, and then the running out to him is a beautiful picture. I think it's Tim Keller who really, I loved his book as well.
Oh, I love it, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, my opening footnote basically recommends that book. It's one of the best analyses for how to sort of preach the passage and about the two basic types of person that these two sons represent.
Yes. Yeah. So it's really the prodigal father in some way.
Yeah.
Rather than prodigal son. What about the lack of ending? So he kind of just drops off. And I think you don't know what happens to the younger son really either. We know there's this repentance and the celebration and so on, but you're sort of just poised.
Yeah, so a really good artist leaves loose ends, and Jesus does that, particularly with this thing that you don't know how the older brother responds. The father comes out to him, pleads with him, and the father has the last word, and you don't know, does the older brother then eat humble pie, go into the party, or does he go away sulking? You don't learn, but you know how you could fill in the ending, because you've got these two preceding stories, the story of the lost sheep first, where it's gone away from home, shepherd goes after it, brings it back, and there's rejoicing. Then you've got the story of the lost coin, where it's something lost at home, woman searches for it, finds it, then there's rejoicing. Then you get the story of the younger son going away from home, comes back, rejoicing, and then the son at home, the older son, and then the missing ending. And so it allows you, on Sudoku principles, to fill in what the ending would be if he responded. So that's one thing about that sort of missing ending. It also works as an invitation.
Right.
So the point is, if you're in that older brother situation, it's like a question mark to you. How do you respond? Because remember, the first two stories in the chapter are phrased as questions. Which man of you, if you have 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, doesn't go after that? The second one is, which woman wouldn't, who, if she loses a coin, wouldn't light a lamp? Then there's no question in the third one. The third story of the two sons. Yeah. But it's like the whole thing is a question.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes. That's good. All right. So I always like to have a little pushback.
Okay. Yeah, I guess.
So, but I'll be honest, there's not almost anything that I disagree with in the book. So, but I could imagine someone saying, this all just seems a little too subtle.
Yeah.
As you do in the book, which is beautiful, there's just detail after detail where it connects in these really subtle ways to these Old Testament stories. I could imagine someone saying, it seems just a little too coincidental, too subtle. How do you feel about that?
I think there's some validity to that. Again, with a good work of art, you may wonder, is the author intending this or not? But what I'd say is, if it's a 3-minute story, you haven't got a lot of material in there. It's only 388 words. That's not a lot from which someone can then find links. So when you find that you've got this old man running, saying quick and then fatted calf, that's just too much of a concentration not to make some link with Abraham. When you find someone running, embracing, kissing, when someone's coming back from a far country, again, that's a very particular thing. And so I think that has to fit. When you get someone bringing out quickly a ring and a robe in the only other instant rags to riches story in the Bible, like the story of Joseph, again, it matches. So you've got quite a few that I think are clear. Now, then what we got to do is we've got to work with sort of background probability. Okay. If you haven't already established a pattern, then you wouldn't have any particular reason to believe that something like where he says, here I am dying of hunger, the younger son, has to link with the fact that Esau comes in from the field saying, I'm dying of hunger.
Mm-hmm.
On its own, it wouldn't necessarily be enough. But when you've already established that there are subtle links and that they're in Genesis and in some of these same stories, then the bar of probability you need to say, oh, I think that link is also deliberate, is much lower. So, I mean, take sort of the Harry Potter stories where you get each of the 4 school houses has alliteration between the 2 people, the Helga Hufflepuff, 2 H's, okay? The fact that each one of them, Salazar Slytherin, has that means that you know that's not by chance. If there were just one of them,
right,
it wouldn't necessarily tell you that. But once you got lots of them, you say, okay, this is something that the author is deliberately doing, particularly when we've established elsewhere that this author does lots of stuff with funny stuff with names.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's where you establish what's the author's way of handling material. Once you've established that the way of handling material is taking lots of details out of Genesis that the scribes are going to see, then I say, okay, let's go all out. And what that means is there are some which, in a sense, our instrumentation may not be calibrated enough to detect them. And I don't mind if someone says, well, I'm not sure. Like, is there a link between the fact that no one gives the younger son anything and the fact that Joseph feeds everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there may be or maybe not. But let's say it can be right on the edge. I'm okay with that.
Sure.
But that won't invalidate the fact that we've got some really central connections which are there.
Yeah. I've thought it this way, that I've got a few friends that are really into Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
The Marvel movies, and even Star Wars, I think, is the same thing. And they will have full-on debates about whether or not something's an allusion to a previous movie or character or whatever. And it almost does seem like they're having a more significant experience when they watch this and catch this allusion to some previous thing.
Yep.
And of course, Jesus is doing something a little different, but it at least shows that he's just completely steeped in these stories, and it just rolls out.
And again, it's a work of art which is allowed to have loose ends. And one of the great things about this, how many good sermons can be preached on this passage? Completely different, very good sermons will work because it is generative. It actually makes others act creatively.
Yeah. I think I've preached the parable of the prodigal son at least 4 times, and I didn't see 80% of what you came up with in the book. So definitely those levels of significance that I think would clearly be there. So here's another sort of pushback. One might say that why is this surprising? I mean, Jesus is God. Jesus is omniscient.
Okay.
Wouldn't this be what we would expect?
So I think that's fine. And some people have objected to the word genius as a feeling it's like actually understating. But I suppose I would distinguish between deriving that Jesus knows everything doctrinally. So he's God, therefore he's omniscient, therefore, of course, he can do that. From deriving it in a sense more bottom up, from the text remains that we have of things he said. And that's the thing I don't see people generally doing. Actually working with these masterpieces of stories and sayings and saying that we can actually put these almost into a competition and say, look, can you find me any storyteller on the planet who's ever told you as powerful a story as, let's say, this one? And I just don't know. I mean, like, who would it be? I mean, Aesop's fables are great, but do they match up? I don't think so. So Tolkien's great, but he's not exactly a master of brevity. It's like he almost needs more space in order to do the stuff, and
to get the same job done.
And you think, wow, I mean, all that stuff in 3 minutes is just mind blowing.
And I do wonder too, and this might be the point that you made about the doctrinal point. So I do philosophy as my discipline, and we would talk about propositional knowledge versus like lived out, or even like wisdom is something a little different than just having a bunch of data or information. And so I'd love to know if you connect Luke chapter 2 with the 12-year-old Jesus Jesus being called wise. It kind of bookends this narrative of him in the temple. I've used this with, I can set it up more, but.
Well, I mean, I do think that it's difficult to know, in a sense, about the consciousness of the Son of God incarnate.
Right.
Okay.
Of course.
So we're given certain parameters. For instance, it will tell us that the Son of Man doesn't know the hour of his return.
Right.
Okay. So it's like there's a computer file which he's not accessing. He could somehow, mysteriously.
Yeah.
But also you learn twice in Luke 2 that he grows in wisdom.
Yes.
So what on earth does that mean? And it seems to me that orthodoxy can inhabit anywhere between basically he knows everything except for, he actively knows everything except for the hour of his return, to he just knows things that it specifically says that he knows. For instance, he knows some people's thoughts sometimes, doesn't he? He knows everyone's thoughts, or he knows there's going to be a guy carrying a water jar at a particular moment, and he knows what the people are going to apply when you go and get the donkey. So there are things like that. That's pretty smart. But therefore, I incline towards the view that Jesus has this amazing knowledge of the scriptures because he's studied them, and that's very inspiring and challenging thing, because it means like he doesn't have a shortcut to knowing the scriptures so well. He actually has applied himself to them. That then you look at Luke 2, and what's he doing? He is asking these experts questions. He is learning. He's quizzing. Now, of course, they're amazed at his answers, so clearly they're asking him questions as well. I'm also struck by Luke 1, where you've got Mary's song, the Magnificat, where there are up to 15 psalms which are alluded to in this fairly brief span, which suggests that she is a woman who has really studied the scriptures. So God gave his Son incarnate a mother who really knew the scriptures. And, and I can relate a bit to that. I had a remarkable mother who, once said to me, well, your father and I have looked into this and we feel it's more faithful to be infralapsarian. And like, this is what my mother's talking to me. It's like, wow, and just when you
were you 12 or
maybe a bit older than that, but it was like, you can have that. You can really be taught a lot by just having a mother who really knows the scriptures. So I think that's where I would incline to see this. But yeah.
And I think there's no problem. I think that's the point about, Jesus, in virtue of his omniscience, could know all propositional truths, but still grow in his talents and his skillful living and those sorts of things.
Obviously the Son of God knows everything, but there is some mysterious element in the incarnation whereby he doesn't have, he isn't accessing things that he knows, if that makes sense.
That's right. I think that's right.
Yeah.
In his humanity, especially how we say that, but leaving some of that to mystery. We won't probably figure that out right here, right now. What do we do with that? What do we do with, I guess what I'm interested to know is how you would see a kind of application point of Jesus's genius and his intellectual prowess and his ability to do these things. Is that, because for me, Dallas Willard would be the guy that I look to as the inspiration.
Dallas, when I first met him, another story like, earlier today, I was just saying I didn't recognize your president, and he gave me a wonderful ride in the car without telling me he was the president. Dallas Willard was like that. We were in, I think it was Hungary or Poland, and I was chairing a meeting, and I didn't really know who he was. And I just heard this old guy doing Philosophy 101, and someone asked a question, and he gave a rather good answer. And so someone asked another question and he gave an even better answer. And soon this room of Europeans who didn't really know who he was realized we had a genius in front of us. But wow, did he allow us to underestimate him?
Oh, wow.
Then I went to meet his colleagues in the University of Southern California, and he had a very high reputation there. So it's an interesting thing of someone who just allows that understatement. But of course, he also wrote about the genius of Jesus.
Yes.
In a different way, because he would talk about, in a sense, the genius of turning water into wine is Jesus's genius knowing about chemical composition. I mean, as in, I'm looking at it more from what I can show from stories rather than that. But definitely complementary element to that. The challenges are, and I learned this from Dallas as well, Dallas Willard, is that a really good teacher simplifies. So Jesus tells this really, really simple story, and it absolutely reaches everyone. A lot of academics complicate things. So Jesus criticizes the academics of his day and says, you take away the keys of knowledge. So that's really interesting. A lot of academia is locking up knowledge so people can't get it. You lock it behind terminology. And so one of the challenges for me as an academic is to be like Jesus.
Yeah.
So use whatever intellect God's given you to simplify things. Because any person can complicate things. You really have to be on top of a subject to simplify it. So that's one challenge. Another one is the challenge to study scripture and expect to see more in it. Another challenge is to study scripture so you can be like Jesus, who had studied scriptures and really knew them very well. Another challenge could be the sort of balance where you got like 62% of the story about the younger son, 38 about the older son. And that just gives you a nice balance to reach the outsider.
Yeah.
In a sense, I think that's just a wonderful proportion to have. Yes, you do stuff for the insider, but there's still this weight towards the outsider.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are so many more sort of applications of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in my own life, it was probably the surprising genius of Jesus that in some ways saved my faith, just going through a time of doubt and questioning and really not sure if this thing's true, and leaning in and finding that it actually holds up, and that, and not even holds up, it's that Jesus, commands us even to love God with all of who we are, including our minds. I don't think that's 3 commands. I think that's just 1 command there. But many people do neglect to love God with their minds. And I know that was me. And again, part of the reason why it's so surprising coming to Jesus and seeing the depth of these stories and his ability to, even in Matthew 22, where you get the command to love God with our hearts, souls, and minds. I mean, he's in the midst of mixing it up with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and refuting them. I always tell my students that, I mean, he could have zapped them, with lightning or something and just smoked them right there, but he refutes them with logic. And they most oftentimes leave in silence, from the interaction.
Yeah,
so
he can silence people.
It's so striking that Jesus, calls us to that life of the mind and that sort of intellectual pursuit of God. And he's right there too. He's the model. He's the exemplar for us as we pursue. Maybe a final question. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on this. Why is this story only here in Luke? Do you have any insight on that?
So, I mean, we don't have many stories in Mark, and we don't have any parables in John. So in a sense, that sort of explains why they might not have them. I mean, John, I think, if it's his last gospel to be written, is particularly there to include what is not included elsewhere. Then you're really just looking at Matthew. Well, his biggest block of speech is Matthew 5-7, where you've got that the lesson on the mount, as I like to call it. You've got other blocks of speech. The other quite long one would be mainly chapters 23 to 25, some in 22. But what you've got there is there are certain things that have to be there for the structure of Matthew's gospel. And in Matthew, you have things that you only have in Matthew, like the parable of the sheep and the goats. Do we want to miss that out to make space for this one? A duplicate. So I think that's part of it. But of course, what we've got in this almost centerpiece, it's not quite at the center of Luke, but this high point for me in his interaction with these different groups is, yes, it's very significant within its context, but it also relates to things we have in Matthew. Matthew 18, we have a story of a lost sheep. And in Matthew 21, we have a story of a man had two sons, but it's a different story of a man has two sons. He says one to go out and work, and he says yeah, and then doesn't, and another he says no, and then does. And it's got the same point about it. So in a sense, there are equivalents elsewhere. And I think God, in his wisdom, has optimized the gospel so that we can study them alongside each other, build up a bigger picture, but also we don't have too much repetition. I mean, so in Luke, we also have things like the story of the Good Samaritan, but it's only in Luke.
Right.
So I think that works well. You've got stuff some major stories only in Matthew, major stories only in Luke. Mark tends to have a less exclusive material, although he does have one short parable there in Mark 4 about this thing growing spontaneously. Why is that? Well, Mark gives you more action and also more detail.
Yeah.
So that's quite an interesting picture.
Yeah. And with the different purposes and, who knows how well the stories would have been told so that there maybe wasn't a need to write it down for Matthew or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's great. Well, thanks so much. Thanks for doing this.
That's
Welcome
great to be with
to Dallas Baptist University here. And thank you for the book and just thank you for your work.
Great to be with you.
Well, thanks so much for watching. And hey, I've got this really exciting scholarship offer to tell you about from Dallas Baptist University. For anybody that's not yet applied to DBU, we are offering a $1,000 scholarship for anybody that would mention this channel. Now, if you've already applied, we still got you. You would qualify for a $500 scholarship offer. DBU is a great place to be. It's honestly hard to find anyone that doesn't love DBU. We have this beautiful campus. It's sort of tucked away right in the middle of DFW, the big metroplex. But like I said, it's beautiful. It's safe. Everybody is warm and friendly. I think what we do really well is we balance a great student experience with an unwavering commitment to Christ and the liberal arts. So do check us out. And like I said, if this is the place for you, then we've got a $1,000 scholarship for you.